Okay, so you want to open a bar. No, no, it's not a bar. It's a social space. Okay, well, it's a club. Well, it's a club, but it's really about artists and about engaging in the community. We want a screening room. But we also would love a bar and a coffee area where people could hang out. It would be great if we had tenants involved, but it would also be great if we had an upper space where people could work and flow together. We want to incubate, we want to encourage and socialize. A place where you can just relax between meetings or obligations. A place where you can have an idea and say, hey, you know, it'd be great if we could do this or we could do that. That's what this space is all about. Hi, I'm John Ridley, and I'm the founder of Milwaukee's No Studios. We created No Studios 2 years ago on the belief that we as people are always better together. And the best that we can do together is share communal experiences and our lived experiences with one another. And in that spirit, we started the Social Justice Summit that we call Art Activated. And so I want to welcome all of you to our 2020 edition of Art Activated, our Social Justice Summit. And this year, we're welcoming new partners in WISN, Channel 12 News, and we're reconnecting with our 2019 partners, the Milwaukee Bucks, and our lead sponsor, the American Family Institute for Corporate and Social Impact. And among those individuals at American Family, I am so pleased to welcome Naira Jordan, who is the Social Impact Investment Director from American Family Insurance. So Naira, welcome. These are unprecedented times, but I hope that you and your loved ones are holding up well. How are you?
We are doing as good as mostly anybody can be doing right now. I say I'm grateful that everybody is healthy and safe, though. So thank you for asking.
Well, look, we're all thinking now about what we can do to be better citizens and partners, but that's something that you personally and American Family Insurance work at year in and year out and have done so for many years. And social justice, I think it means a different thing to everyone. And I'm just curious, for you personally and for American Family Insurance, how do you look at social justice? What are the things that are most important to you? And certainly they're all important. But when you think about it, what do you think of when people say social justice?
Yeah, when I think of social justice, I think of equity and how can we provide access and opportunity. For American Family, Wisconsin is our home. Therefore, we want to be active participants in all of these conversations that are happening here around equity and justice. That's why in 2018, we launched the Institute, because we believe that this demonstrates our commitment to closing equity gaps across America. So our focus at this nexus of social impact and today's social justice movement, we believe positions us to be partners in our communities in making meaningful change. And so for me, and we talk about communities as if it's this external thing. It's our employees, it's our customers, and it's me. So these things that we're doing impacts my family, it impacts the people I love and the people I care about. So for me, equity and access and opportunity is key. And it's the social aspect side. It's also the economic opportunity side and upward mobility and being able to provide access to our communities to be able to be economically sustainable and viable as well.
I appreciate what you're saying in terms of businesses and corporations really taking a top-down approach. That it sounds like a bit of an old saw, but leadership begins at the top, right? And communities are built from the top. And when you talk about things about equality and economic equality, those are so very important. And one of the things that I struggle with when I talk about social justice is trying to make sure that people understand that while sometimes it may look a little different from community to community, it really affects us all the same way. When people have job insecurity, that's a social justice issue. When people have food insecurity, that's a social justice issue. And you talk about being here in Wisconsin, how those issues may look in Milwaukee may seem a little different than Rhinelander, but we see up north in Wisconsin where farms are collapsing at an exponential rate, and folks are faced for the first time with food insecurity. And all of a sudden, it's not us versus them or urban versus rural, but how do we feed our families? How do we connect as a community? How do we make sure that our children have equal opportunity for the best education? How do we make sure that all of us have a voice? And what I do appreciate is when individuals make that their life's work. It's not just, hey, let's talk about this once a year, but let's make sure that whether it's in large events or in daily exercises, we see ourselves in others.
Absolutely. I think that is so key. And, we talk about it as a corporation. I think the thought is that a company comes in, we have financial resources and people resources, and we come into a community and I think the people have their idea of what that community looks like. But you're absolutely right. This is Wisconsin, where we're seeing some of the greatest disparities in our country. And our goal is to connect with all communities that are being impacted. So that proximity to community and that lived experience is key. So for us, it's having that authentic, intentional, purposeful connection to communities, understanding what those problems are, and then identifying where our resources will be most impactful. So when I talk about having that purposeful partnership, that is very intentional to us, because we want to make sure that we understand how all communities are being impacted, what those different needs might be, and then let's apply those solutions to those different communities. And that's just part of our strategy. It's how we operate as an organization. It's not a corporate responsibility strategy that sits separate from our business strategy. It's all integrated for us.
You talk about implementing some of these strategies. Can you talk about, even if not specifically, because I don't want to, if there are things that are proprietary information, I don't want to put you on the spot, but if you can talk about moments where you have felt that impact, or you've witnessed that impact, or organizations, neighborhoods where you've been to, and you come back later and say, wow, this is, as you say, it's more than dollars and cents. It's more than just talking the talk, but had the opportunity to witness lives changed, bringing people together, or people, again, just being able to see themselves in others. Are there examples that you're able to share or care to share?
Absolutely. I mean, we've been working in this since 2018 with our institute, and Milwaukee has been a key focus for us. So there's an organization called Second Chance Staffing that we connected with really early on to help individuals that have been justice involved get their records expunged. And that's where, for me, I even had a deep education of understanding the impact on the type of employment an individual has access to if they're able to get their records expunged, and just the dramatic increase that could be for someone's ability to earn a certain amount of wage. And this is me coming from somebody that comes from a family that, we have, I have people close to me that have been connected to the criminal justice system. And I didn't have that level of awareness that I learned from interacting with Second Chance Staffing. So that is one profound example for me that I saw for myself that was educational, but also seeing the impact that it has on individuals and communities that have been justice involved.
Well, I'll tell you, one of the things that's really important to me, and by extension to No Studios, more than anything, and you talked about this, the lived experience. People who are not just, and I've been in that business, so I don't want to disparage talking heads, but I'm talking about, pundits on the news who just talk about things. But the difference between those individuals and people who've lived all sides of the issues. And one of the things that I really appreciate is that you're allowing us, through our Social Justice Summit, to bring people together on all sides of the issues, to talk, to engage, to feel like their voices are being heard. Because what's very important to me is that any of these issues, as raw as they may be, as difficult as some of these conversations may be to have, that people really are coming together with their lived experience, working towards solutions that are equitable for everyone. And if we're not talking, if we're not engaging, and one of the things that breaks my heart is I just believe we're in a space now where if you talk about talking to someone on the other side of the aisle or the different experience, people get mad at you for wanting to start those conversations. So one of the things I really appreciate is that you are allowing us to bring folks together, to have discourse, to set aside what anyone else may think outside of those lived experiences and say, hey, we're going to work together, because if we don't work together, all we do is fighting against one another. So I want to thank you for that. And again, if there are, moments where for you, those discussions and those discourses have been valuable, are there any in particular that you can recall that have been very valuable for you?
Yeah, we, a big part of the Institute is convening conversation. And so even here in Madison, we've had situations where we've brought in law enforcement, We've brought in nonprofits, the school district, the county, the city, all of these individuals at the table to solve a problem. And we had an issue around justice-involved youth. And instead of one organization disconnected, trying to have a conversation and come to a solution, we had the decision makers from all of these different entities at the table, solutioning and ideating on what this could be. And we have individuals with their lived experience that were at the table as well. That's where the innovation happens. And that is key when we think about how we want to work with communities. For us, we want all the stakeholders it's a criteria for us. All the stakeholders have to be at the table.
Well, Naira, listen, you and American Family Insurance and the Social Impact Division have been amazing supporters, and you have allowed us to bring folks together this weekend. Despite the pandemic, people have really stepped up and wanted to be part of these conversations. So we're looking forward to a weekend of discussions and topics ranging from police and community to voter suppression and the role of social media and commentary and discourse. And tomorrow evening, we're going to share an interview that I had with Lieutenant Governor Mandela Barnes. And I'll also have a chance to chat with Dr. Yusef Salaam, who is one of the exonerated 5. And throughout the weekend, we're going to have live music, films, and artists discussing their work in different venues and online. That is so important to me because my whole career has been built on, again, that communal experience and using art as an apparatus to deliver empathy. Everybody who's watching, you can go on to nostudios.com and see our full calendar of events. And I ask you to all please stay tuned because we're kicking this off with an incredibly important discussion, our panel on policing and community, and that's going to be moderated by Derek Rose, who is one of the reporters at WISN Channel 12 News, who is one of our new partners. So Naira, again, thank you for everything you're personally doing, and thank you to everyone at American Family Insurance and to everyone watching. Please stay tuned for our upcoming discussion on policing and community.
Black Americans disproportionately affected by police violence. It's happening across the country and here in Wisconsin.
You don't want to see one more black man who is, it's not only a difficult engagement, but shot 7 times in the back.
A year of protests, unrest, and calls for justice. Tonight, WISN 12 News is partnering with Oscar winner John Ridley and No Studios.
It's about people listening. It's about people engaging. It's about people being empathetic and really working towards solutions.
Right now, a WISN 12 Project Community Special, a panel on community and policing.
And good evening, I'm Derek Rose. We are honored here at 12 News to partner with No Studios and its Social Justice Summit. This panel on community and policing is also streaming live right now on WISN.com, the 12 News mobile app, and at nostudios.com. First, for tonight's discussion, let's hear from No Studios founder, Academy Award winner, and Wisconsin native John Ridley.
Derek, it's very good to see you again. And my thanks to you for moderating this panel and to everyone at WISN for being part of this discussion. For me, social justice is about the ability to see ourselves in other people. And that includes being able to have sometimes difficult discussions, sometimes painful discussions. But if we don't all work together, then we're all working in opposition. And I think we've seen particularly over the last year that really gets us nowhere. So I'm very excited about the upcoming panel on policing and community. I'm so grateful to everyone who has chosen to join in these conversations. And I also want to encourage people to follow our Social Justice Summit this weekend, where I'll have a conversation with Lieutenant Governor Mandela Barnes, as well as Dr. Yusef Salaam, one of the exonerated 5 from New York City. And you can follow all that, as you say, at nostudios.com. So Derek, again, my thanks to you and my thanks to everyone at WISN for amplifying our message on being together in the communal experience.
All right. Thank you very much, John Ridley. And we want our guests to have as much time to speak as possible. So let me introduce our panel really quickly. First, there's Faith Kohler. She's an attorney and former federal agent who is now a filmmaker and visual artist. Also tonight joining us is Chris Wilson, who splits his time between Baltimore, Maryland, and New York City and works as a visual artist and social justice advocate. And we have Brady Anderson, a civil rights lawyer and former prosecutor who has practiced both in Wisconsin and in Oklahoma, where he was the legal director for the ACLU. Also joining us tonight is Jamal Smith, an activist who also works in the city of Milwaukee's Office of Violence Prevention. And finally tonight we have Michael Brunson. He started with Milwaukee Police in 1995 and is currently serving as the acting chief of police here in the city of Milwaukee. I want to thank all of our guests for joining us tonight, and I want to get right to our first topic. I want to start with the idea of systemic racism. Author Robin DiAngelo wrote a book called White Fragility: Why It's So Hard for White People to Talk About Racism. Last week, she told our own Soledad O'Brien, quote, "It is about power. It is about one group's collective bias. We all have bias, but when our group's collective bias is backed with legal authority and institutional control, that transforms it into systemic racism." So to our panel, let's discuss, is there systemic racism? How does it affect policing? And how is it unlearned or dismantled? Don't all jump in at once.
Well, I can go. Jamal Smith again from the Office of Violence Prevention. When I hear this question, it kind of reminds me of the line from New Jack City when Ice-T was asked, was Nino Brown a part of the CMB? And when he said, "Can Michael Jordan slam dunk?" It's kind of similar to that, of saying, absolutely, there is an existence of systemic racism. Listen, we can't sit here and have a conversation about systemic racism and make it seem as if this is not problematic. To me, what would be the point of a social justice summit if there's no such thing as racism, sexism, homophobia, xenophobia? These are all real concepts that really exist and are problematic today. So when we look at examples of systemic racism, we can look right here in Milwaukee, right? We talk about the report from the 24/7 Wall Street that says that of the five cities that are the worst for Black folks in this country, 2 of them reside right here in Milwaukee. In Wisconsin. Number 1 is Milwaukee, and number 2 is Racine, right? So we have to understand the impact of systemic racism and how it plays a role. Let's talk about a couple instances within how systemic racism plays a role. One, we could talk about home ownership, right? We have to understand that Associated Bank was required to pay $200 million for discriminatory lending practices, and Wisconsin was one of those states. We realized that Black home ownership right here in the city of Milwaukee is under 10%, right? That's systemic racism. When we talk about healthcare, when there's a conversation about how doctors have prescribed painkillers less for Black patients than they have for white patients, because historically it is of a belief that Black patients have a higher pain tolerance than white patients, right? Or when we talk about employment, right, where resumes with ethnic names, my name is Jamal, right? Resumes with ethnic names are declined or discarded at a higher rate than those that are considered regular because of the fact of a cultural fit, right? Or feeling as if the historical mindset is that Black folks are lazy, which is ridiculous given the fact that Black folks were the face of this country and the reason why this country actually exists based on our labor. So when we talk about systemic racism, we have to look at that power and who it benefits. And who it benefited, the people who it benefited don't look like me. They don't have my face. They don't have my skin color. They look different than me. So systems have been in place, and that's what we try to really elevate within the Office of Violence Prevention. When we look at violence, we look at it from a public health aspect, and not just the conversation about interpersonal or communal violence, but how do we look at systems, structures, institutions, and how they have been very much complicit and responsible for a lot of violence that has existed as well. So when we talk about even the impact of poverty that exists right here in Milwaukee, Mahatma Gandhi said poverty is the worst form of violence. But we understand that there's concentrated poverty within communities of people that look like me, in marginalized, disenfranchised communities. So we have to be honest in our conversation. If there's going to be any change, we first have to be honest in the existence of the violence that has happened systemically, structurally, institutional wide, and systemic racism is indeed a problem. So then also when you talk about how that looks in policing, we are looking at how policing impacts or how that comes on, looking at ways in which social issues are being more policed, more so than we talk about behavioral, right? So people are being policed in disenfranchised communities more so because of systems that have been in place and policies that have been in place. So we look at the people who are impacted by systems more than we look at the systems themselves.
I'm going to jump into and address just how does that look in policing. You know, I come from a background in law enforcement, and I'm also an attorney. And when I look at the economic disparities, when I look at the disadvantages in some communities versus others, and I ask the question, how does it affect policing? I think we have heard a lot recently in the wake of some of these police shootings where people say, oh, that officer was a bad apple. And I go back to the analogy of an apple and say, well, if it's a bad apple, is it a bad barrel? If it's a bad barrel, is the orchard diseased? Because I think what we're looking at in terms of systemic problems with policing, yes, it stems from racism. I think some of it stems from perhaps a disconnect with the disparities, the poverty, and the impact of all of those disparities on behaviors, on communities. You know, and I feel like, in essence, when we look at how do we unlearn that or dismantle it, you know, one of the questions I ask when I see implicit bias training being offered to police departments, I think, well, you know, perhaps it's a good start, but how well is inherent bias training going to work if the system itself is inherently racist? And so I think the dilemma is we do have to not necessarily unlearn, we have to understand the disparities and where they come from. We have to acknowledge them, yes, as Jamal said, but I also think that we have to break this apart and see what communities actually need in policing versus what we as a society have been giving them with policing. And I think that's a big problem that I hear in a lot of the interviews I've been doing for my most recent exhibit, Salvage, is understanding community perceptions about policing. And the biggest thing that I hear, the strongest denominator in these interviews that I've been doing is many people in our disadvantaged communities don't feel as though anyone's asked them what they need. And when they do need something, where is there to call? Resources are scarce. The police become the first responders for pretty much any social problem that ends in a glaring need and a call to someone. And I think that's how we've ended up with police responding to homelessness, to mental health crises, domestic violence. These are issues that are systemically broken and have gone systemically not addressed in a way that's really brought constructive and sustainable solutions to the people who are impacted by them. So I would say that's how it affects police, is police are wholly unprepared to address the social issues that are causing calls for police service in their communities.
Chief Brunson, do you agree with that police departments are unprepared in addressing these kinds of issues?
Well, I think what has happened over time is that when there's no other entities that can address problems, then police are there 365 days out of the year, 24/7. And so what has happened is that police have been called and their role has been broadened so much that that is the first thing that people think of when they need assistance, no matter what the problem is. And so what that has created is a situation in which police are obviously in demand because they are the social entity that is always there. And so it's easy sometimes for people to pick up the phone and dial 911 and have the police come and address a problem. And so you have a situation as described previously where although police are trained for a number of things, they're called to things that maybe there is another social structure that would better handle that particular problem or situation.
All right, thank you. I'm going to switch our topic now to the issue of transparency. George Floyd's death in Minneapolis puts a spotlight on this topic specifically. The Washington Post reported the initial statements from Minneapolis police did not mention that an officer knelt on Floyd's neck for more than 8 minutes. Police only noted Floyd, quote, appeared to be suffering medical distress. In Wauwatosa, during protests after an officer was cleared in the shooting of a teen at Mayfair Mall, the police department and the chief initially only shared self-produced videos on social media in an environment where no questions could be asked. It was 5 days until the chief took direct questions on camera. So my question to the panel, is law enforcement transparent enough with the community, and is the community understanding and patient enough?
I think I might jump in on this one and say, frankly, it's often no to both. The reality is that I think in a couple of ways, right, we have had a problem with transparency in law enforcement for as long as we have scrutinized law enforcement. And that goes back to really the bad role that police have to play here. And going back to what we were talking about a moment ago, we have a system where we've been developing, a systemically racist society in America, really throughout Western culture for probably about 900 to 1,000 years, give or take. That takes a while and it creates some serious systemic issues. Well, law enforcement's very role is to protect and preserve a system, right? It's to conserve things, it's to protect things. It's not necessarily to change things. So law enforcement's going to be that first flashpoint, which means it's going to have an incredible amount of scrutiny. And unfortunately, we're seeing problems on both sides. I absolutely see rushes to judgment, and I've probably been guilty of rushes to judgment. And yet I've also seen incredible examples just in these last few months even of incredible amounts of false statements, of misleading statements by law enforcement, of things that seem designed at times to obfuscate the truth, to literally get people out in the streets rather than keep them from, whether that's things like, Kenosha even making up a curfew that never existed and they're still prosecuting people for it, or whether it's the Wauwatosa video of the bicyclist arrest that seems to completely contradict what law enforcement says. or whether it's right back to innumerable killings, innumerable murders like that of George Floyd, where we were told initially as a public that wasn't a murder. It was just an officer involved shooting. It was just a tragedy. And we have to find out later that that's the case. One of the things I found in working with law enforcement for years and members of the public is that both the rise in transparency and the ability of people to give law enforcement, in a sense, the deference they feel they need, or at least be able to listen, go hand in hand. And it's when they break down, it's very hard to be able to actually rebuild the two without being able to really address both almost simultaneously. And that's really the challenge I think we face now.
So I would like to second what you said. And coming in from Baltimore City, you know, I think back to 2015 with the death of Freddie Gray, when all of the cameras, the whole world was focused on Baltimore. And you know, I was, I guess, naively optimistic that there would be some change in our city. And, you know, there was a lot of investigations. We uncovered a lot of corruption within the police department here in Baltimore. However, those officers were not charged, or they were charged, but they were not convicted for the murder of Freddie Gray. And then also, there still has not been any transparency on holding police accountable for, you know, when they're accused of things. And so, you know, I think that's a big problem, and it's something that we're not talking about enough.
I'm going to tack on to that too. Thank you, Chris, for bringing that up, because one of the things that I think the public sometimes doesn't see is the need for due process. When a police officer is involved in an incident, there's, you know, it says, as Brittany was saying before, there are administrative violations that they could get fired for. There are potential criminal charges that they could get charged with. But I think one of the biggest sticking points that I've had with some of these incidents where police have actually caused the death of citizens during an in custody or custodial experience is, if that's how they're trained, if they're following what they were trained to do, if there's a reasonable belief, like if their department hasn't banned chokeholds, and they're technically just following what they were taught to do, it puts a monkey wrench in the system for accountability. And to me, it comes back to, we need to actually excise the problematic laws. We need to excise the problematic regulations, go back and take a look at how it is that over all these years, from Freddie Gray, Breonna Taylor, like I look at these things and I say, it's what happened isn't right morally. It may have been justified legally. It might even sometimes thinly pass muster to keep someone their job. But when we know it at their heart that these killings are morally not right, what are we doing to go back and change the laws so that these loopholes don't exist and we actually can have true accountability, starting with what the law says? Because I feel like that's really what is so problematic in the whole notion of giving officers due process and doing these investigations, is there's so many technicalities where they might be in bounds that, to me, it says the problem is the system.
And if I can just comment really quick on that, honestly, we live in an era where you can be fired quickly for an email as a police officer than you can for actually killing someone. When we look at what happened with Eric Gardner in 2014 and the chokehold, when he said, "I can't breathe," that was a legal chokehold, right? So we really have to look at the process and the policies that exist that allow for the autonomy that happens within policing. And when we really examine and analyze and juxtapose the ways in which the response happens towards policing, we have to understand that when it comes to that whole idea of transparency, the first thing is we got to be honest in recognizing how there are policies, to the previous panelist's point, there are policies that are on board that allows for some things to happen in the manner that they do, and it shouldn't be as such, right? So we have to be willing to bring about that challenge for reform to make sure that when we talk about protect and serve, that's exactly what the focus should be. is protecting and serving. And then the whole aspect of due process, right? It's not the responsibility of an officer to be judge, jury, and executioner, right? The whole thing that we should be focusing on is due process. Let's just be transparent here. Jeffrey Dahmer is one of the most notorious serial killers here in Milwaukee. And I'm just going to say globally, and he got a trial, right? But when we look at what happened in terms of Jacob Blake, that's a whole different response. So when we look at Jay Anderson or Andreas Gonzalez or Joel Acevedo right here, that's a whole different response, right? And they were victims. So we got to understand really when we have this approach in terms of policing, we got to be willing to really call out the elephant in the room. And sometimes that's going to be uncomfortable. But my statement to that when it comes to discomfort is get comfortable being uncomfortable, because these conversations are necessary.
And Chief Brunson, he mentioned the Joel Acevedo case that happened here in Milwaukee, and you being the acting Milwaukee chief, I wanted to get you in on this topic of transparency, and for you and the department, the balance of providing as much information as you can to the public, accurate information, but also protecting the investigation. How is that balance handled in the department?
Yeah, obviously it's a delicate balance. We want to make sure that the investigation, the processes are functioning the way that they are supposed to, so that individuals will get a fair trial, so that there will be no reasons for a mistrial, or for, in the case of, let's say, an employee action, we have a standard operating procedure that we follow. In addition to that, there are open records laws too that we have to follow. And so we want to make sure that we do not do anything that's going to violate those things, because we don't want a verdict to be overturned, for example, or to impact what may happen later. So we always have to be careful of those things. I know that across the country, we see incidents that occur in different municipalities. And we see that sometimes chiefs, for example, are able to fire those individuals almost immediately. However, in Wisconsin, specifically Milwaukee, we do have due process for officers. We have to follow our standard operating procedures. If we don't do that, then we give cause for an individual to come back and to potentially be reinstated. So we always have to be careful in going through that due process. One of the things that I always want to try to be is transparent. However, I'm always mindful of that process, because I don't want a decision that I make to be overturned due to us not following the standard operating procedures and the laws that are in place. So it's always a balancing test.
And I want to follow up real quickly, Chief Brunson, because I know you are always accessible at crime scenes. I want to thank you for that when there's a situation here in Milwaukee. And something, and I know you put to your officers to say when you have a press conference, is that the information we are releasing is preliminary. How often do you see that preliminary information not be accurate as you thought it was when you released it initially?
Oh, that's quite frequent, that as you dig more into a situation, you find additional facts, you find additional witnesses, you find additional physical evidence that you didn't know initially. And that's why I always try to say that this is preliminary information, and that we will provide more information as we develop it. So that's part of it too, as far as not wanting to give out false information, because initially you might have an inkling of what occurred, but you don't have all the facts.
And if information does change, Chief, how do you handle when you would get an accusation from members of the public saying, "Oh, they weren't telling the truth from the beginning"? When in cases the information that changed, the initial information may not have been intentionally misleading.
Well, we try to definitely follow up and make those corrections as quickly as possible. It can be a press release at times. I mean, if it's a very serious situation, we can do a press conference, but we do try to correct that record to the best of our ability, even using our social media pages and things of that nature to correct the record, because we want to be accurate. You're right. I mean, once you lose credibility with the public, then it's very hard to regain that.
And for the rest of our panel, if you see that situation where information does in fact change, how do you trust the police department? How does that conversation go in the community?
Well, for a long time, you don't trust them. That's the exact problem. Is you don't. You stop, and the question becomes, for how long? How long does it take to rebuild that trust? And in fact, I think that's one of the most important things to train officers and leaders in law enforcement in, is exactly that. That, okay, if you're going to say something misleading, if you're going to try to bend the truth, so to speak, don't just think about the consequences for you. Think about the consequence for every other law enforcement officer who is ever going to encounter any of the people who will hear your lie, because they will never be treated the same way. So much of what's going on in terms of the breakdown of policing and public relations right now is very much about trust, and neither side being in a position to as much trust the other. And that has an impact in every police encounter every day that is repeated thousands and tens of thousands, and nationally hundreds of thousands of times. And if you repeat it enough and both sides say, gosh, I don't quite trust you, I'm not quite sure if you have my best interest at heart. So if I'm the officer, maybe my hand's a little closer to my gun. If I'm the member of the public, maybe I'm doing something that's not very smart. Maybe I'm a little closer to running or for going for a weapon or that kind of thing. When we have that happen, eventually it produces a breakdown that inherently is going to make violence happen. It's going to make tragedies happen. And sometimes that's going to be measured ultimately in citizens who literally lie dead, who are tragically killed, and sometimes with officers. But I think that trust issue has a direct relationship with all of those encounters that we repeat thousands of times a day. Every traffic stop, every Terry stop, as we say as lawyers, right? Every time an officer comes up to somebody and says, what's going on? I need to see your identification, that kind of thing.
Sorry to cut you off here,
enough,
Brady.
and that's going to be an issue.
Sorry to cut you off, Brady, but we have to take a quick break. We are out of time for this half hour, but our conversation continues online. Our community and policing panel discussion is streaming online for another half hour. Just log on to WISN.com or our 12 News Facebook page to continue watching this conversation.
All right, we are clear. Off TV.
I know we're off right now. I wanted to clarify inaccurate information and lies. Those are two different things.
Yeah.
So I was referring to inaccurate information, and we find more out later, not misleading.
All right, we are here still streaming on our on community and policing. Our next topic for our panelists, I want to talk about a little bit of history here. The fight for racial and civil justice spans centuries in this nation. We all know that. In 1967, President Lyndon Johnson appointed the Kerner Commission to uncover causes of deadly riots in cities across the nation. 43 killed in Detroit, 26 killed in Newark. The report concluded racism spurred the violence, but its policies for change were never adopted. Just 2 years ago, in 2018, Smithsonian Magazine looked at that report and concluded bad policing practices, a flawed justice system, unscrupulous consumer credit practices, poor or inadequate housing, high unemployment, voter suppression, and other culturally embedded forms of racial discrimination all converge to propel violent upheaval on the streets of African-American neighborhoods in American cities. That was 53 years ago. So the question for our panel, between then and now, has anything changed from what was in that report to what we are seeing play out, especially here in the year 2020?
I can start with that one and just listen to what you said, Derek. Look, here we are. This report was initially pushed by Otto Kerner, who's the governor of Illinois. And at that time, it was deemed that you had two Americas, right? Separate and unequal, one America black, one America white, right? some of the pressing issues of that was income, employment, home ownership. Here we are, to your point, now we are 53 years later, we're still talking about income, employment, and home ownership and the disparities within it. So when we see a lot of the uprisings that are happening across this country, right, and the things that are leading to that, and we're seeing a lot of times people are more upset in terms of the uprising that are happening, but people are less entitled or less likely to speak on the injustice. We should be speaking, then we should be speaking on the uprisings. Now, clearly, no one wants to see burning buildings and all of that nature. But my thing is, we don't want that to happen. No one wants that to happen. But at the end of the day, what are we doing to really address the injustices that are happening in terms of what we really mentioned? So here we are again, 53 years later, and we're still having the same conversations. So even though we may say that there's been marginal improvements and the likes, and based on some measurable scale, we're still having the same conversation, and that should be deemed problematic. And that goes to my original point of talking about the impact of systemic violence and how that is just as relevant as interpersonal or communal violence. And we got to be honest, what I'm saying? There's conversation about law and order and all that. Law and order should apply to systemic injustice as much as it does to communal violence, right? We must hold accountable those systems to the level of control that has happened and that has led to a lot of the disparities that we continuously see. There should be law and order over those systems just as much, as we have the conversations about what happens within communities. So if we really want to see the end of many of these injustices or many of these uprisings that are happening, deal with the root cause of why those uprisings are happening. You have to deal with the injustice.
And Derek, you asked the question, what's changed? And when you were reading off that list, and I was thinking like, okay, gee, all of the above are still the same. But really what has changed, I think, and I think Chief Brunson would probably agree, is the way we police has actually changed in the last 53 years. I look at, we have names for things. We talk about trauma-informed care. We understand what causes violence now. We've done studies over the years. We've brought community policing into communities. And what we're finding is, in many ways, it's still not working. And so the way we've policed, it to me sort of seems like what's changed. And it seems like, if anything, it's brought to the forefront kind of that dichotomy in policing. How can we come in and do community policing? Police are supposed to be there to protect and serve, but there are so many communities in this country that don't want the police there. They don't trust the police. They don't respect the police. And in fact, they are afraid of the police. And I think the other side of that coin is, because the way we've policed, on the other side of that coin is the increasing militarization in the way we police. Back then, and 53 years ago, it was National Guard troops. Now we have tactical squads, right? And as I said, Chief Brunson, I think you'd agree. We suit up, put on Kevlar vests, riot shields, full automatic weapons, and go out onto city streets. And that is what many citizens in our neighborhoods are greeted with. So I think when you look at the Breonna Taylor situation, I think when you look at how building entries are done and no-knock warrants in high-risk cases, I think the way we've policed has ramped up the fear in communities. And to me, that's the only thing I see on that list that's changed, Eric.
Go ahead. I'll say this about policing and looking at 53 years ago, 1967. When many of the riots were occurring. I would say I've been on the job for 25 years, and I have seen a monumental change in law enforcement agencies. I'll specifically talk about Milwaukee. Milwaukee now, the police department is much different than the police department. And I'll tell you why. You have leaders that will listen to the community, first of all. During that period of time, Harold Breyer was the chief. He basically told citizens, he told some priests and some clergy members, I don't tell you how to run your church. You don't tell me how to run my police department. So that's the kind of police chief that existed back then, Frank Rizzo in Philadelphia. You can go through and look at those chiefs who didn't want to hear anything from the community. Now you have chiefs that listen to the community, that are part of the change, part of the reform. You have body cameras now where we can see problematic officers and address that. Up until 5 years ago, if we had a problem officer who got complaint after complaint, and it came down to his word against a citizen, we couldn't independently verify who was telling the truth.
Yeah.
Now we do audits where we look at officers. There are situations where we can get rid of those problem officers. In the past, we couldn't do that. In addition to that, 8 Can't Wait is a national campaign regarding use of force and reform. The Milwaukee Police Department now, working with our Fire and Police Commission, is basically implementing all 8 of those practices. So those are changes. In addition to the Collins Agreement, where every stop has to have supervisory oversight. Those things didn't exist just 3 years ago. Now that is the way that we're operating forward. So those are some monumental changes that I didn't see in 1995. I didn't see in 2005 even. So now we can hold officers accountable. You see officers being prosecuted now for their actions. I didn't see that in 1995, very rarely. I didn't see that in 2000. So officers are being held accountable in many circumstances in which it just didn't exist many years ago. And it definitely did not exist in 1967. I can tell you that.
And Chief, for those of our viewers who are not familiar with the 8 Can't Wait, could you elaborate on specifically what those 8 items are in that campaign?
So the 8 Can't Wait is a national campaign, and it's through Campaign Zero. One of them is requiring officers to de-escalate situations. One is stop officers from using chokeholds or other restraint techniques that cut off oxygen or blood flow. Require officers to intervene and stop excessive or unnecessary force by other officers. One is to restrict officers from shooting at moving vehicles. And then one is limit the type and use of force or weapons that can be used to respond to specific types of resistance. Require officers to exhaust all other reasonable means before resorting to deadly force. Require officers to give a verbal warning when possible before using serious force, such as shooting, tasing, and pepper spraying someone. And finally, requiring officers to report each time they use force or threaten to use force, e.g. pointing a weapon at an individual. And so our policies now, they're being changed right now. There's a few of them. We will be in compliant elementally with the 8 Can't Wait very soon.
And I was going to ask Chief, how hard is it to change policies? Because we've heard a lot of discussion for these protests and these social justice movements about reform, and a lot of it goes to policies that are existing in police departments. How hard is it to change those policies, either internally, independently, or when you have cases, when you have police unions that are involved in negotiating contracts with the cities on what they can and cannot do?
Well, when those policies are changed in many cases, for example, we have a fire commission here in Milwaukee, but we also do what's called a meet and confer with the unions to have conversations with them about the changes. And then there's a discussion as it relates to that. So that's how that works as it relates to the change in Milwaukee. We work through that with our Fire and Police Commission. We are able to provide input, obviously, about the challenges that a particular method may cause on our agency. And we were able to do that, for example, as it relates to shooting at moving vehicles. We already have a policy as it relates to that, but there are very rare circumstances, I'll say that, in which that may be something that's required. You have situations where an individual runs into intentionally a group of individuals who are in the street, for example, and a person is using that car as a weapon. So there are some exceptions. And so those are the things that you have to discuss, because when you make blanket policies sometimes, then those are the things that individuals are sometimes not considering. So that input from the police agency is very important, even though the Fire and Police Commission ultimately has that authority to give those directives.
I've done some work with police unions in other parts of the country as well. And to echo Chief Brunson, I think we see similar things really throughout the country in terms of things like the meet and confer process. But one reality I think we've got to face is that in most jurisdictions, unions have virtually a veto power on reforms. And generally speaking, they are simply not a pro-reform force. You know, the question is not, gosh, will the police union, will the FOP be for a particular reform? It tends to be, how strongly are they going to fight against it? And that's been, I think, one of the biggest disconnects between reform-minded citizen groups, those of us who are in the streets marching, those of us who are activists, and then you have the police unions on the other side, and often police leadership or police and fire commissions are actually in the middle of that, really trying to deal with both sides of it. And that's an enormous challenge right now. And in terms of making policy, one of the challenges that we create, going off Chief Brunson's words, were that, yes, we want strong policies, but yet so much of what's happened in policing that we decry as activists is the lack of humanity that we see in it now, in many practices, in militarization, for instance. Well, part of humanity is also officers who have discretion to use their humanity, right? To do what they need to do to deal with another human, not a commodity, not an object. So that's a very difficult challenge in terms of both how you get reform done when there are anti-reform forces that are heavily entrenched, but also when you can do it, what does it look like? As the chief said, how do you balance new policies with the need to really have officers be able to use good judgment in the field?
In preparing for this discussion, I was thinking about something that happened to me this past week when a photographer and I arrived at the Milwaukee County Courthouse last week for the DA's decision on the Alvin Cole Joseph Mensah case. As soon as we got out of the car, there was one protester in particular, a black woman, who instantly berated myself and another black journalist who was from another TV station. She called us race traitors. I didn't take it personally because I know this woman didn't know me personally and didn't know my background or my history. But it made me think of black members of law enforcement who we have seen often treated in the same manner when it comes to these clashes between protesters and police. So how does what we've seen this year have an effect on the job performance, the psyche of black officers? And do members of the community seek out these officers specifically to engage in the positive conversations to get insight on the department and how they operate and how they interact with the community?
So I can speak to this as it relates to what you're talking about. And I'll say this, over my career, and more specifically, I remember in 2016 when we had civil unrest here in the city, myself personally and other African-American officers, we were insulted much more by African-American members of the crowd who called me and other African-American officers every pejorative that you can think of. And so that, unfortunately, is something that occurs. We actually had to rotate African-American officers off the line because they were taking so much verbal abuse from some citizens who were upset. And we find that quite frequently, unfortunately. And just like you stated, over my career too, and just going to call for service, when individuals are upset, they will come at African-American officers. And I was a victim of that on many occasions where I was called, all the names that you can imagine by African-Americans. And that's disheartening to me, because one of the things that we want to encourage in our city, one of the goals of most police leaders, and myself included, is for the department to reflect the community. far as the demographics. But if African American officers are receiving that type of abuse, in addition to some of the invective and animus that's directed towards law enforcement, then that generation that's coming, why would they want to become police officers to engage if that is the treatment that they're going to receive? So that is one of my biggest disappointments and challenges that I see, is that if this negative environment that we are in towards policing is so concentrated and focused, that many young African Americans and Latinos from our communities are not going to choose to go into that profession. And we need those young members of our community to be a part of the agency, to take that next step, because I'm at the end of my career and I'm moving on. And we need them to come and take this job and move forward.
Can I jump in right quick and speak to this a little bit? So I am actually guilty, not of using profanity and stuff towards African American officers, but I have been in situations here in Baltimore City where I have been pulled over for driving a nice car 26 times in a period of 2 years. And there's been situations where officers like, where the drugs at, where the guns at? And it's like, I'm on my way to class. And I've been so upset where like tears have ran down my eyes. And I've said stuff to Black officers who stood by and watched white officers like treat me unfairly, take my driver's license from me and cut it up. And I would say stuff like, how can you stand by and watch this happen as a Black man or as a Black woman? Like, this doesn't bother you? So, I mean, I sympathize with folks who are angry about it. You know, I don't think people should be necessarily disrespectful, but I do sympathize with people who feel that kind of way, because it's painful to experience it and witness it.
Yeah.
And I think if we take a look at where that comes from, though, you know, think about what that says. You know, John Ridley said earlier, you know, with social justice, we see ourselves in other people. And so when we have people of color who are looking at law enforcement, who may be of the same race, of the same ethnic background, and all they're seeing is the part of their identity that they wear, that uniform, the part they fear, what that says to me is that not only are police not perhaps representative of the community just from a racial and ethnic standpoint, but there's a cultural disconnect when people are afraid of the police and all they're seeing is the uniform. And that goes back to, Jimmy, that underscores the larger problem here, which is I think the way we police is not reflective of the needs of the community.
Yeah. Completely agree. And I would say to that, it's more of an indictment on the system, right? Like we're sitting here right now in an era, you know, as we're talking about Wauwatosa, right? And seeing the shootings of the killings of Andreas Gonzalez, Jay Anderson, and Alvin Cole, and that was by a Black officer, right? And it's really an indictment of the manner of how policing happens. And even if there are Black officers there, and I know we have League of Martin and all that, and one of my mentors was a part of the League of Martin, but it does not change the tension that exists within police community relations. So when people are looking at officers that identify as Black, I see that badge and that blue, right? And I understand my experiences that have happened because of what has occurred within my community in terms of policing. And that's what I equate that with. Now, I'm not saying that we need to be, you know, berating or insulting officers. That's not what I'm saying. But at the same time, we have to understand why that happens, right? It's just the mere fact of seeing that shield and that uniform and how that policing has led to a lot of the treatment of Black and brown residents within communities, and understand why there is a tension there. So we have to understand, again, looking at a system of policing, right? And not necessarily individual. And then let's just be more transparent. We've also seen data has shown that there have been Black officers that have been just as aggressive in terms of how they're policing in underserved, marginalized communities as white officers, right? We have to look at that. We got to look at that because of the system that exists. So if there's not going to be a change within a system, then we're going to continuously have these conversations. So that's why it's important that we first acknowledge the violence within systems and then say, how are we going to reform or change the very systems that perpetuate that violence?
Well, and I just want to tack on to that too, because, you know, being in the Office of Violence Prevention, I mean, one of the things that I think really has an impact on officers and how officers feel, and a number of them whom I interviewed for Salvage, this exhibit, some officers are afraid going into communities where violence is the norm. You know, I really feel like when I was in law enforcement, some of the more scary moments were going through a doorway and not knowing what was on the other side. All I ever wanted to do every day was just go home to my kids. And so I feel like we also have to look at what is causing the violence in communities that are not necessarily related to the police, but also have an impact on the police. Because I think that's where we get into this vicious cycle of police are afraid, citizens are afraid, and that sort of perpetuates itself. And look at the outcomes. They have not been good.
Which goes back to my original point, which I totally agree, is we have to understand if we're not going to deal with the root causes of the injustices, then we have to understand why that's perpetuated when we look further into violence that happens within communities. I mean, let's just be, you know, being fully transparent, right? When we talk about a lot of the violence that happens in community, first off, we have to understand the impact of trauma and then the psychological impact of that, right? And talking about mental health and how that permeates itself through our communities. All those conversations have to be real, upfront, and they have to be candid, right? We cannot hide the existence of the reasons why violence is happening within communities. I mean, this is here is a quick analogy right now. Like if you were at a party and there was 10 kids, right? And you bust up, you have a piñata at a party, and you bust open a piñata, and one piece of candy falls out of that piñata, and you got 10 kids that are sitting there. What's going to happen with those 10 kids? All 10 of those kids are going to go at each other trying to get that one piece of candy. So when we look in neighborhoods and see how there has been concentrated intentional efforts to deprive a particular population of resources for them to live their best lives, then what does that do to them psychologically? What does that do to them mentally? What does that do to them emotionally, spiritually, physically? And we have to analyze that and figure out what is the root cause of that and figure out the ways to change it.
You know, back
And
when
I think
was
that'll
at
have an
APLU,
impact on.
I used to constantly, I love to refer to things as broken system. And I'm sure many of us have loved to say that, right? Oh, the system is broken. And then I realized how stupid it was, because I realized, no, the system isn't broken. It's doing exactly what it was designed to do.
Exactly.
You know, we've got to understand that so many of the systems in place in our society, particularly on the economic front, are doing exactly what people designed them to do, because the people who designed them were the people in power and they wanted to stay in power. And you can break that down along race, you can break it down along, you know, sheer economic inequality, but it really comes to, I think, the same place. And that's that we can't just look at how do we reform the police. We can't just look at it and say, oh, this is all the police's problem, this is all that. No, we got to look at it and say, what do we do about bigger issues? Part of what's been breaking down in policing is a reflection of an incredible breakdown in our whole society. You know, we're coming to terms with, I think, as Biden put it, the original sin, you know, of our country. And I think that's a very powerful way to think about it. That are we finally to the point of potentially having a real conversation about this and the 1,000 ways in which seemingly innocuous parts of how things are set up in our world actually function to keep rich people rich, poor people poor, people in bad neighborhoods in bad neighborhoods, good neighborhoods in good, etc. And if we do that, fundamentally, there's no way that conversation can be both candid and comfortable. We don't get to choose that. If it's going to be honest and transparent, it's going to be hard. But yet I think exactly even events like this are part of that, and coming to terms with each of our individual roles in it, but also as a whole, what our decisions are really doing, what those of the people who came before us have done.
We've got just a few minutes left for our last topic. I just want to move on here real quickly so we can squeeze this one in. Following the death of George Floyd in the nationwide protests, we saw members of the Milwaukee Bucks, including MVP Giannis Antetokounmpo, on the front lines of protests. Once the NBA resumed its season in the bubble, players wore social justice messaging in place of their own names on their jerseys. The NBA court also had the message Black Lives Matter on it. Yet the response from some is that athletes are just overpaid whiners and should just shut up. There was even a moment of unity at the beginning of the Chiefs-Texans NFL game where players stood locked in arms, yet you heard boos from the stands. So my question, why is there so much anger directed at these kinds of people, athletes or celebrities who have platforms to raise awareness about social injustice? And are things like social injustice and racial equality political or moral issues, or both?
Personally, I believe that it's both, right? And there's a quote that says racism is so American that when you protest it, people are thinking you're protesting America, right? So when we what we can't do is act as if this is a new phenomenon in terms of speaking against injustice. Like, are we really going to ignore Tommy Smith and John Carlos, right, for the '68 Olympics, right, when they had the black fist on the stand, on the Olympic stand, right, fighting against, speaking against injustice, right? This is something that has happened for a long period of time. This is nothing new, right? So when we look at it from a political aspect as well as a moral issue, and I'm glad that you brought up the aspect of the Chiefs and Texans, because one of the opposing points to the protest has been whether disrespecting the military by kneeling, disrespected the flag by kneeling, where they stood in unity and saying we are standing to fight against injustice, and they still got booed. So now that sends a different message, right? It's not, now we're not even talking about the flag. We're not even talking about the national anthem. We're talking about the fact that speaking against injustice, and particularly Black Lives Matter, really offends many other people. Why? Because we know that's a discomfort when it comes to the ways in which racism has permeated through our country. So we got to understand when it comes to these athletes using their platform, and I applaud them. I applaud that the Bucks were the first to say that we're not going to play and we're going to protest. We're not going to play in this game as a protest for injustice. But we have to understand that sometimes civil disobedience brings about that discomfort. And as I said earlier, you have to get comfortable being uncomfortable because of the fact that people who have been marginalized and disenfranchised for centuries have been experiencing that discomfort for a long time. So if we're not willing to really acknowledge the impact of that racism or that sexism or that homophobia or that xenophobia, whatever the phobias or the isms that exist that lead to the injustices, which is why we have a social justice summit in the first place, then we're not going to have any progress moving forward. So the first thing is you're going to have some disobedience. You're going to have some people who speak up against the injustice, and you're going to have people who say enough is enough, right? Because we're not supposed to just sit back and tolerate that, right? So even James Baldwin talks about that. I feel as if I'm in a position where I can speak against a lot of the injustices that are happening, right? I should be in that position where if I see things that are happening against what the concepts of a country is, which is freedom, justice, equity for all, right? Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. If that's not happening for all people, I should be able to speak against that, because that goes against the very nature of what this country is supposedly founded on.
Anyone else wanted to comment on that subject with athletes and activism?
I'll comment on it. I think, I actually I applaud the athletes for making their voices heard and using their platform to do it. And so what if people are uncomfortable with it or whatever? I think that's what it's going to take for people to be uncomfortable, because this is a real issue, especially for Black and brown people. And so I would do it too. So we got to talk about it more. We got to do more, and we got to get out and vote.
November 3rd. Any final thoughts from our panelists?
I know I've been talking a lot, Derek, but I just got to say this. The first thing is I want people to understand this, and this is something that I live by, and I've said this repeatedly. I want people to recognize my color, but acknowledge my humanity. And when I say that, yes, I'm a proud Black man. No question about it. Anybody who knows me, I have no position. I have no quarrels of letting people know I'm a proud Black man, but at the same time, I am a human being and acknowledge the humanity that is in me. And the second thing is we have to understand if we really are about that change, then we have to understand first why we're seeing so much that is happening in speaking against injustice. I got to give a shout out to the People's Revolution. We have the longest standing protests against injustice happening right now in the country. We have organizations that are working on ground that are speaking against injustice. We have a community collaborative commission that is working along with MPD, and Chief Brunson knows this, in terms of working on SOPs. We have our Office of Violence Prevention. We have the African American Roundtable. We have the Black Liberties Organized, Black Leaders Organizing Community, which is Leaders Igniting Transformation. We have so many organizations that are working against this injustice. My thing is support those efforts, because if we are truly focused on building equity, not equality, equity, then we have to support those efforts that are being elevated to truly fight against those injustices that are trying to break down that equity from happening.
I guess we will leave it right there. I want to thank you guys.
Without saying nothing else, y'all.
I feel like I've been talking too much too. I don't want to.
No, we've covered a lot of ground here in this hour. Yes, go ahead.
Oh no, there's one other thing I would say, and it follows right along those lines of the notion of recognizing humanity. Like Chief Brunson, I've been called a race traitor too. Some people who are white get called that when we're out there marching with a banner with a bunch of folks from the NAACP. It happens the same way. And I remember a speech I gave years ago where, I basically answered my own question of why am I here? I happen to be the only white guy speaking. And I said, really simple. And it happened to be over a gentleman who was killed, who was murdered by police, a guy named Terrence Crutcher, to say his name. And I said it very simply, and I would say it here. I said, I'm here because he's my neighbor, period. I think if we can think about that and realize we're all in this together, whether we like it or not, whether we're comfortable with it or not, and eventually we got to figure out what does that mean given an incredible legacy of people not wanting to be neighbors on equal terms. What do we do about that as a country? How do we start dismantling basically 25 or so generations of white supremacy that we've only really worked hard for about 3 or 4 to dismantle? It's going to take some time, but it's recognizing we're neighbors. It's recognizing everybody has that humanity.
And real quickly, I would just say this. Obviously, everybody here is passionate about the issues. I would say don't hesitate to work with the police and agencies and leaders that are willing to engage and to change and to move forward, and that embracing reforms and the changes that can occur in policing. We can't give up. The community and the police, we have to work together. There are a number of problems that we face in this city. I know there's a lot of challenges in Baltimore, very similar. So we can only address those things as we work collectively to rebuild that trust to move forward.
All right, that will conclude tonight's discussion on community and policing. Again, we want to thank our panelists, Faith Kohler, Chris Wilson, Brady Henderson, Jamal Smith, and Chief Michael Brunson for contributing for us. We also want to thank John Ridley and No Studios for this partnership, and we welcome you at home to share your thoughts on the WISN 12 News Facebook page. For all of us here at WISN and No Studios, I'm Derek Rose. Have a good night.
It's your boy, Nile X Nile. Music to me is freedom. It's a sense of security and knowing that I can literally express off the top of my head anytime I feel without regrets. I enjoy just being a part of something as big as this. And that's what I feel like music means to me. Music
to me is the greatest form of expression. It's versatile, multifaceted. It's just whatever you need it to be in whatever moment you want it. It's like the alpha and the omega type shit. There is nothing without music, you know?
When I'm listening to music, it makes me feel like I'm the only person in the world. It helps me alleviate all my problems and allows me to escape into a song in a different universe.
Music is my soul, and the reason why I feel empowered to be myself every day. Without it, I probably would be a boring person. Am I supposed to keep talking?
I'm a 5'2" little beast when it come to this. I'm the light.
That is really what music means to me. It is the thing I need when I'm feeling a little crazy. Music is everything to me. It's a release, it's work, it's patience and practice, it's love.